Hello, my name is Alan Hepburn, and today we're going to be talking about a subject that will primarily be of interest to IFR pilots, a change in the Canadian requirements for getting an instrument rating that came on the scene back in 2017. The requirement to fly a continuous descent profile on non-precision approaches. Here's an extract from the flight test guide. We'll look at it more closely in a minute. Despite the 5 years that have gone by, there's still a lack of guidance on how these techniques are to be applied. Before we get into that, however, I'll make some general observations on changes that have had a profound effect on the IFR system in Canada in recent years. I did a count of IFR approaches in Ontario in August 2022, and there were 103 airports with unrestricted IFR approach procedures. All of them had RNAV approaches, 48 of which went to LPV minimums. 15 airports had ILS, and 4 had plain vanilla VOR approaches. If you have DME, add another 5. And if you are ADF equipped, another 14. No doubt the other provinces are similar. What this says to me is that flying IFR in Canada has quietly become primarily an RNAV operation. In the aftermath of NAV Canada's NAVAID modernisation plan, traditional aids approaches other than ILS have become so sparse that they are virtually irrelevant, particularly when you consider that you will always have the option of flying an RNAV approach, probably with advisory vertical guidance, which makes it procedurally a lot like an ILS. Just a few years ago, RNAV approaches were definitely in the minority. If these numbers don't convince you, take a look at this picture of the US IFR low chart for the airspace between Toronto and Montreal. I've used the US chart because the Tango routes, RNAV Airways, are shown in blue and stand out, whereas the Vector Airways are shown in black. Not much black around. The aircraft is assumed to have dual C-146 compliant GPS navigators. Without two, in many areas, you won't meet CARS 605.18J, which pertains to equipment redundancy. If the GPS is not C-146 compliant, it is only approved for supplemental navigation. And since we're already at the point where the traditional aid system no longer provides adequate primary navigation coverage, there's often nothing for a non-C-146 navigator to supplement. Perhaps as significant as what's on this panel is what is not. The ADF disappeared in 2002, and the DME went not long after that. The GNS 530W still gives me VOR ILS capability. While using continuous descent techniques also applies to traditional aids approaches, these have become largely irrelevant, so I'll discuss them in Part 3 under Unusual Approaches. Here's what the flight test guide has to say about CDFA. If you use the old step-down techniques, also known as dive and drive, on your IFR flight test or pilot competency check, you will be considered to have made a major error. We don't want that. The words here are a little vague as to which segments of the approach procedure CDFA applies, but the intermediate segments they refer to are probably those that are aligned with the final approach course up to the FAF. Here's the definition of CDFA. It's quite clear here that CDFA is to be used, quote, for flying the final approach segment from an initial altitude at or above the final approach fix altitude, end quote, So that says that CDFA may start before you cross the FAF. I interpret this to mean that you have to be stabilized by the time you cross the FAF. It takes about 2 miles to get stabilized, so you should start your descent about 2 miles before the FAF or further back. Some of the charts suggest you don't start down until you're much closer to the FAF, but I find this can make things rather hurried. When using CDFA, after you initiate the final descent, you fly a stabilized approach, details of that on the next slide, all the way until you start the flare. If you reach the minimum descent altitude and don't see the runway, you start the missed approach right away by climbing straight ahead on the final approach course. There's no leveling off until you pass the missed approach waypoint. CDFA only applies to non-precision approaches, so we'll forget about ILS approaches and RNAV approaches with approved vertical guidance, that is, to LPV minimums. The latter apparently don't meet the ICAO definition of a precision approach, but for the purposes of the IFR flight test, they are considered to do so. Here's the definition of a stabilized approach. Basically, everything has to be set up and all checks completed, and the descent has to be stable within these defined limits before you can declare the approach stabilized. Once you are stabilized, only minor control inputs should be required. If anything exceeds these limits after you're stabilized, you go missed. The transition from level flight to a stabilized descent is not instantaneous, so you have to allow a mile or two after the descent is initiated before it can be said to be stabilized. For a typical 3-degree slope, 2 miles is equivalent to about 650 feet. So that 1,000 foot above ground level requirement would have you start your descent at 1,650 feet above the ground level or higher. Sometimes this allows them to recommend a top of descent close to or right at the FAF, but I'll stick with my earlier recommendation of around 2 miles, which makes things a little more relaxed. The idea is to minimize the workload and to have nothing to distract you to the extent that you fly into the ground during the critical final approach phase. The main reason for introducing CDFA was to reduce the number of controlled flight into terrain accidents. This RNAV approach to runway 26 at Kirkland Lake is a typical RNAV approach. It's actually simpler than most, since it only has LNAV minimums and no step-down fixes before or after the FAF. Unlike US charts, Canadian ones now support CDFA by including a CDFA table that shows the height of the glide path versus distance from the missed approach waypoint. The slope heights, and indeed all heights shown on the chart, are absolute. They show the actual heights above mean sea level. The indicated height will be subject to whatever errors are inherent in the technology of the height indicating instrument you're using. For decades, the only instrument we had for measuring height was the barometric altimeter. It has to be set to the local altimeter setting. If you do that, it will read the correct altitude when you're on the ground at the altimeter source. But as soon as you leave the ground, it will be subject to temperature errors, unless the atmospheric conditions match those of the International Standard Atmosphere Model. We'll get to that shortly. If you can't get the Kirkland Lake altimeter, the RAS box here tells you to use Erlton's. No adjustment is required in this case. The primary use of the CDFA table is to help pick your top of descent point, where you will start your continuous descent. In a non-radar environment, you'll have to transition via one of the published initial approach fixes, VASNA, Ahmed, or Sassoul in this case. Once you've been cleared for the approach and are within 25 miles of the fix specified in the 25-mile safe altitude designator, the runway threshold in this case, you can come down to the specified minimum safe altitude, or MSA. In cold weather, you're required to determine what indication you will see on your barometric altimeter at this and all subsequent minimum altitudes, the assumption being that you'll be using this instrument to determine your height. Also note that, fairly recently, circling minimums were removed from the majority of RNAV approach procedures. Since most runways now have approaches to both ends, it's now considered safer to shoot the approach for the reciprocal runway. That's no doubt true, because a circling approach in minimums weather is about the most dangerous thing you can legally do in IFR. For most RNAV approaches, the C146 compliant navigator will present you with advisory vertical guidance, which you and/or your autopilot can follow down to the MDA. Like any GPS-derived height, this slope is fixed in space. It doesn't require an altimeter setting or temperature correction. This greatly simplifies CDFA since you have graphic vertical guidance, even though it's not approved, all the way from the segment before the FAF to the runway. Once you've intercepted the glide path, you keep the glide path needle centered, just like an ILS. Advisory vertical guidance is a creation of Garmin-Jeppesen, and NAV Canada has no notation on their charts about whether it will be available. For it to be available, two things have to be true. The information on the slope, which is generated by Jeppesen, has to be in the navigator's database, and the WAS signal has to pass a real-time integrity check. If either of these checks fails, you will only see LNAV, no plus V, following the procedure's designator when you try to load it. If there's no plus V, all you will have to go on is the vertical speed, which matches your ground speed on the chart, and the slope crossing heights at each fix. You can't tell from NAV Canada's charts what gradient the advisory vertical guidance will follow. It seems likely that the gradient will match that in the CDFA table, but you sometimes get advisory vertical guidance even when that table is blank. There's always a caveat that, since the guidance is unofficial, following it does not guarantee that you will avoid busting minimums. But in practice, this appears to be the case. We'll talk a little more about this in Part 3 under US differences, because the situation south of the border is a little different. If you want some advance warning of lack of vertical guidance, advisory or approved, just try loading the approaches you might expect at your destination well ahead of time. Other than in the extreme north of the country, where WAS reception may be intermittent, if you see LNAV plus V once, you should get it again later. But don't try this on the ground. WAS may not be available there, particularly soon after you turn the navigator on, or if there is not a good view of the southern sky. Of course, before you start down, you have to be cleared for the approach, but you also have to respect the 125-mile minimum safe altitudes. On the 600-700 navigators, once the approach is loaded, you can check your distance from the minimum safe altitude origin by touching it on the map. The distance is shown in the pan mode information. Without this information, the navigator will only show you distance to the next waypoint. But since you're not going to descend instantaneously, eyeballing it will usually do the job. The Garmin 400-500 series equipment has similar capabilities, but the font is so small it's not much use. However, there are other ways to see this distance, which we'll cover in the practical demo. Here's the CDFA table for the RNAV 26 approach at Kirkland Lake. As part of your pre-approach briefing, you should use this table to select your top of descent altitude and distance. Doing this will ensure that you don't wind up with the top of descent too close to the FAF or find yourself above the slope when you join final. You should do this whether you expect advisory vertical guidance or not. The only difference will be that, with advisory vertical guidance, you'll start the final descent when the needle centers. Without it, you'll start down when you reach your selected distance back from the missed approach point. The maximum gradient for which NAV Canada populates this table is 3.5 degrees, which works out to 370 feet per mile. There's a top of descent altitude recommended on the instrument approach procedure. It's the number without minimum or maximum bars, 2,700 feet in this case. It's usually the highest of the published transition altitudes, but it's not necessarily what I'd recommend. In this example, 2,700 feet would put the top of descent only 0.7 of a mile from the FAF, which I contend does not give you room to get stabilized. I'd pick at least the 6-mile figure of 3,100 feet, since that is 1.9 miles before the FAF. 3,100 feet is above the minimum safe altitude of 2,900 feet, so we can get by with a single descent stage, with no preliminary descent required after crossing the initial approach fix. A second table at the bottom left of the chart lists your target vertical speed against ground speed. If you don't have advisory vertical guidance, using that rate and checking the 2,500 foot slope height at the FAF is all you've got. The only mandatory height requirement is not to bust minimums, and adherence to the published slope heights at the step-down fixes should assure this. But remember that caveat about advisory vertical guidance. Check your height as you approach each step-down fix. Don't attempt to check your height against the CDFA table every mile. The idea is to decrease the workload, not increase it. Here's the RNAV 06 approach at Saint-Jean, Quebec, where a 2-stage descent would be required. The minimum safe altitude of 3,500 feet is not within the CDFA table, so you're going to have to make an initial descent to your chosen top of descent altitude when you cross the initial approach fix, then level off and commence your final descent when you reach your top of descent on final approach. If we want 2 miles to get stabilized, our top of the descent will have to be at least the 6-mile, 2,100 feet point on the glide path, not the recommended 1,600. So we'll want to start down at about 6 miles. That means that we'll have 1,400 feet to lose on our initial descent. The minimum transition altitude is 1,600, so since we'll only be descending to 2,100 feet, that won't be an issue. Now, can we lose 1,400 feet in the 4 miles from the initial approach fix to Pibza? You can use any rate you're comfortable with, but to confirm in advance that you'll be able to get down, it helps to be able to do the arithmetic in your head. The standard 3 degrees is 318 feet per mile, which doesn't make for very easy mental arithmetic. 333 feet per mile is easier, because that's 1,000 feet in 3 miles. That works out at just 3.1 degrees, so that's pretty close to standard rate. To figure how many miles a given number of thousands of feet will require, simply multiply the thousands of feet by 3. For a 1,400 foot descent, that would take 1.4 times 3 or 4.2 miles. But we've only got 4 miles, so we'd be leveling off in the turn. That's not ideal. Let's look at something a little steeper. The next easy number for mental arithmetic is 400 feet per mile. That works out at 3.8 degrees. At 400 feet per mile, we descend 1,400 feet in 14 divided by 4, or 3.5 miles. So that saves almost a mile. In this case, 400 feet per mile will work. For an even steeper descent, should we need it, the next easy number is 500 feet per mile, or 4.7 degrees. In practice, use the best rate of initial descent you can manage immediately after crossing the initial approach fix. Have your speed back to approach speed before you get there. This kind of planning is vital to avoid unpleasant surprises. If you're going to be using the barometric altimeter to determine your height on the approach, there are two altimeter corrections you need to be aware of. One, the one you use if you don't have the local altimeter setting, and two, correction for below standard temperatures. The former is simpler because the same correction applies to all minimum altitudes cited on the chart. At Pembroke, for example, if you were using the Ottawa altimeter, you'd add 160 feet to all the published minimums. If you're using a barometric altimeter to indicate your height, the errors due to temperature are sufficiently significant that, when the airport temperature is below zero in Canada, or -10 for some higher MDAs, the barometric indication for every altitude on the approach chart must be calculated to account for the below standard temperature. You use the temperature correction chart from the CapGen to determine the corrections, which will be different for each altitude. Note that you use height above the altimeter source with this chart. You get the height of the source from your GPS or from the approach chart. Let's look at what's involved in converting the 2,900 foot minimum safe altitude at Kirkland Lake on a -20 degrees centigrade day. 2,900 feet is 1,700 feet above the airfield level. Interpolating between 1,500 and 2,000 foot corrections in the CapGen, we get about 250 feet. So our barometric altimeter will indicate 3,150 when we're at the 2,900 foot minimum safe altitude. If we didn't do this calculation and just flew the barometric altimeter, we'd be too low. 1 down, 5 to go. Since that adds up to a lot of numbers, you're going to need a separate piece of paper to jot them all down. That's starting to sound like a lot of work. We'll see just how much when we look at the airborne demo, which, to avoid a long trip up to Kirkland Lake, will be done at my home airfield of Pembroke, Ontario. I hope to see you for the next section of this video. Until then, blue skies and tailwinds.